classic. Why always compare us to Sweden? Sweden is a quarter of the population of the UK, plus most in Sweden don't live in cramped tower blocks. Right. I'm saying that Sweden is they are the control for the experiment of lockdowns. They followed pre-pandemic planning. Our pre-pandemic planning, World Health Organization pre-pandemic planning, not only are there excess deaths from all causes over the last few years, so not just COVID, it's not the only disease that matters, are they lower than ours? And most of Western Europe, they are lower than every other Nordic country as well. Countries that did lock down. Countries very similar to Sweden. They are the proof that we didn't need to lock down and you don't have to have the damage of lockdown. And yes, I'm going to bang on about this. Yes, until every single person involved in locking us down and justifying those policies accepts and stands up at the COVID inquiry and says, I was wrong and we must never do this again. Until that day, I will never shut up about this. This is existential for our freedoms, for our children's future, for mental health, for physical health and for our economy. I will never ever stop fighting for us to finally get the common sense and justice on this. I don't want apologies to people who lost loved ones to COVID. We've had all of that. The time for emotions is over. We need cold, hard facts. And if our politicians haven't learnt lessons from the cold, hard facts that are already before us right now, then we are in a heck of a lot of trouble coming up in the future. He said we should have been prepared to impose a wider, earlier and more stringent lockdown in order to hit the pandemic hard. We should have lockdowns again for future pandemics, including flu. We'd failed to plan for lockdowns. It was all about having enough body bags to dispose of the bodies rather than trying to control the virus. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's wrong. I think he's not wrong that there was an inadequate plan, but what that tells us is that all plans are inadequate. You can't plan for something like this. Your plan should be, we don't know how this pandemic works. What are the questions we need to ask? He's quite right that they planned for the aftermath of the pandemic rather than preventing it. But we now know pretty well for certain that lockdowns were not the best way of dealing with this pandemic, because at the same time as we were locking down, we were sending hospital patients to care homes and spreading the infection that way. And we were protecting the laptop classes, but in order to keep society going, we weren't able to prevent the virus spreading. And we saw this again and again. They kept coming back for more lockdowns later on when, and then, finally in the Omicron wave at the end of 2021, they predicted a terrible range of deaths if we didn't have another lockdown. We didn't have another lockdown. There weren't that many deaths. Sweden showed that focused protection, voluntary protection is a better way to go. Command and control, trying to do these things from the top down is not a very clever way of doing it. Matt Hancock was very explicit yesterday. He said, we don't know how many people there even are in care homes.
Yes, well, they didn't know how many care homes there were, apparently.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what's so extraordinary, isn't it? This is the thing I find...
But that means that you can't do it top down. If you don't know that information, then stop trying to control everything from the centre, put out sensible advisory suggestions about how to stop the virus spreading, and let people work out themselves arrangements to try and do it.
And as we know, in the first lockdown, the infections, the actual spread of infections had already peaked before we actually locked down because people were taking sensible precautions. I caught COVID March the 16th, 2020. I know exactly when I caught it because I was at a super spreader event, my brother's 40th birthday. And we'd advised my father, who was in his late 70s at the time, that he shouldn't attend that event because there was going to be a lot of people who mixed with a lot of other people and it wasn't wise. And thank goodness, because 7 of us, a third of the people went down with COVID. Some were hospitalised. We always took it seriously. But the point was, I didn't have to worry because I'm younger and healthier. I certainly never worried about my daughter going to school like this. Schools should never have been shut. And goodness me, we know the lessons of that now with the ongoing issues with children missing from school and mental health and physical health problems and all of that. But this is the thing, is it not extraordinary that someone who was at the heart of that decision-making, and it was, it really was Matt Hancock and Michael Gove who were making most of those decisions, chairing those COVID meetings, is that they don't seem to have learned any of the lessons. They didn't look at the data then, and they're not looking at the data now. It is not possible to have half a brain and to look at the data from around the world and here and to think that lockdowns were the right policy. I just don't think it's possible to look at Sweden, to look at Florida, to look at what happened in the UK, even like with masks and the like, between the different constituent parts of the UK, and to still think that these measures work. How are they able? I mean, it's doublethink, isn't it?
Well, we need to get these decision-making classes to take a good hard look, particularly at Sweden, but also at other things. And they go, oh, Sweden, that's nonsense. Well, it jolly well isn't. Johan Anderberg has written a very good book documenting exactly what happened in Sweden. They never had compulsory lockdowns. They never closed the schools. They had strong advisories, as we did, suggesting that people take sensible precautions. And the result is the lowest excess deaths over the period of the pandemic in the world, as far as we can tell. Certainly of the G7 countries. Yeah. It's best to say. So one does need to look hard at that. And, you know, some of the worry I have is that the inquiry, the people on behalf of the inquiry that question the politicians, they're all coming at it from the same direction. Yeah. They're all saying, why didn't you lock down harder? Why didn't you do it earlier, etc.? Nobody is saying, hang on a minute, are you sure focused protection, voluntary procedures, not forcing hospitals to discharge patients into care homes, are you sure all these centralized top-down decisions weren't the problem rather than the solution? They're not saying that. Yeah. So they're all, as it were, pushing in one direction.
And this was always our worry, wasn't it? That the COVID inquiry would be, shouldn't we have locked down sooner, as the fundamental question. And certainly the questioning we've seen of those giving evidence so far, you know, former prime ministers and health secretaries and the like, has all been focused on, you know, on austerity seems to be the biggest one. Brexit even got blamed briefly by Matt Hancock. I mean, it is worrying. Although I have to say, I still think there are some very big issues about our first-class civil service and their ability to pandemic plan. I don't really think that is the job of cabinet ministers to be doing that. They're not experts in this field. We really do need to look at the people who do the actual work and who advise governments, because the man who basically brought us lockdowns, Neil Ferguson, it was him having that conversation with the then Prime Minister, advisor Dominic. You know, he was the reason why we locked down. We were not going to lock down otherwise. We were going to go down the Swedish route. We would have saved ourselves all of the woes we've got now, economically and health-wise, if we had gone down the route we'd been planning. And it was him with his absurd, we're going to lose 500,000 people if we don't lock down computer model that did this. He's still advising the government right now.
Yeah. And the WHO, there was, I think, rather a comic moment yesterday where Matt Hancock said, but I took some comfort from the fact that the WHO had said we were the best prepared country, or one of the best prepared countries. Well, whenever the WHO says you're doing something well, you want to count the spoons. You know, they are an organization with a terrible track record in Ebola, in the COVID origin story, in lots of other things, in vaping, etc. So this tendency to trust bureaucratic top-down decision making over common sense is really at the root of the problem, and not to admit ignorance. You know, you have to be able to say, look, we don't know how this virus is spreading. It might be airborne. I remember a meeting in Parliament that many parliamentarians attended very early in the pandemic, in which Chris Whitty briefed us on what might or might not happen. Somebody said, well, what about the tube? And he said, no, the tube's fine. Well, I don't think that's actually very good advice for an airborne virus. You know, so there was some extraordinary things based on, I don't know, influenza models or whatever, that made them too certain about what was happening and therefore not open enough to changing their minds.
Absolutely. I think that's the absolute key. And as we know, the key thing with science and evidence is you should be always open to new evidence. Matt, really, you've been an absolute star through the last few years, speaking such, just common sense and all of this. Lord Ridley, co-author of Viral, the search for the origin of COVID-19.